Welcome back, artists. I'm Wyatt Paints, and today, the talented sculptors over at SuperShark released a Scott Summers statue to celebrate the release of X-Men 97, and they tasked me with slinging some paint to bring them to life, making them today's sponsor. Now, this sculpt has a range of painting challenges that I think is well suited in exercising our artistic muscles by overcoming some of the very common roadblocks that we face in painting. Metallics, skin, painting yellow. Yay, we get to paint yellow. Oh, how much I love to do that. But if we think through our process and take it on in manageable steps, I'm sure we're going to get great results. So, meet me over by the painting table. I'm going to grab my brushes. Let's get started. Starting with the base. This is a fairly Spartan design, with just the Xavier Institute plaque front and center and a bit of battle damage. I want to keep the painting here simple, so that I can save that time for painting Scott. I'm thinking 2 main colors and a bit of shading is all that's needed. To start us off, gunmetal from the new Fanatic line. I haven't got to try these paints out yet, so I'm kinda hyped for the first go. As far as metallics go, this one is pretty buttery, and it dry brushes really nicely. It's slightly brighter than I'm used to with a gunmetal, but that's far from a deal breaker. A short 5 minutes into painting, and I already had the makings of a very fine base. For the battle scars, a bit of Nolan oil. I normally don't break out the oil so early in a project, but since I can get a bit forgetful, it's a good idea to do it now, then forget it later. It's nothing too intensive here. I just want to trace out each scratch and ring each of these little bolt heads. While these areas should get skipped over during the earlier dry brush, taking the time to reinforce these spots makes them look a bit more purposeful. You could take this a step further and shade all the notches in the cable, but here I didn't think it necessary. Since the sculpted details are so nice and sharp, the readability from a distance was solid. Although I did want a bit of highlighting from a touch of silver. Unfortunately, my bottle of silver is a bit craggly. I can't really use this as a normal paint anymore, but it's fantastic for highlighting metal. It's hard to catch that edge highlighting on camera, but trust me, this makes the edges nice and crispy. Once it was looking sharp, I turned to bright bronze for the center medallion. While you usually want to dry brush your metallics over black, the outer ring that got a bit of overspill won't really affect it. At worst, if the bronze is thin in a few spots, I'll have a bit of a halo highlight around the outer ring. And at the end of the day, if I need to, I can just do an extra pass to get that pure bronze tone. The only real pothole to look out for is getting too wild with your strokes and sullying the gunmetal from earlier. But even then, that touch-up will be quick and painless. When buffing up the lettering, try to use a circular brush pattern. This will make filling in the negative space around the letters a bit easier. And any spots that you may only get partial coverage will just end up looking like a little extra bit of weathering. Next on the table, light tone. This was a quick thin wash over all the lettering just to make it a bit easier to read. Then a heavier application around the X in the areas that would catch extra gunk and rain. While we could really lean into this weathering on the base with oil drips and verdigris, I want a bulk of my painting time to be used on Cyclops and not what he's standing on. Also, beyond any time aspect, the main goal is that I want the viewer to look at Scott. So while I want the base to look good, I don't want it to distract from the principal subject. Ideally, I want the base to be the last thing they notice. But with that said, it could still use a bit more attention. So I grabbed greedy gold to break up all that silver. Nothing too crazy, I just went around and gilded all of the bolts, being careful to just hit the tops and not cover up those oil rings I did previously. Then I used it as a light dry brush over the letters, again, for the sake of readability. After giving a few minutes to dry, the base was done and looking mighty fine. Time to take care of Scott. Now, traditionally, Cyclops has a pretty basic color scheme. Blue bodysuit, yellow undies, boots, belt, bandolier, and visor. While comic accuracy is cool, I like my figures to be sometimes a bit more grounded. So that means if someone were to actually put this outfit together with real-world items, they most likely would not all have the same uniform color. With that said, Since his visor and body harness thing always looked to be metal, and I still had the greedy gold out, that's going to be how I'm handling it. Personally, I think dry brushing is the best method to get perfectly smooth metallics, but it's messy. So I want to do this early, when painting messy is the name of the game, and any overspill on this step will be covered up later. So it's a very small price to pay for some super shiny bits. Perfect. Time to hop over from metallics to the skin with sanguine and barbarian flesh. So this means breaking out the wet palette and mixing up some in-between tones to have at the ready. Roughly, these mixes are 75-25, 50-50, 75-25, and I did one extra at about 10-90. Starting with the darkest mix, all of the exposed skin got base. Extra care will be needed around the visor, so go slow and paint clean. Any overpainting now will mean having to rebase in black and start over. This is because any touch-ups on this will most likely not have the metal flake lying in parallel with the rest of the surface, so the luster and finish will be off. So save yourself the heartache and be very mindful where your brush is going. Once dry, I noticed my base was a bit thin in spots, but with all the layers I'm going to be adding to it, it's not going to matter. With the next color up, I began building up to the mid-tone. This should cover most of the face, only leaving the exposed undercoat in the strongest of details. I also try to leave a slight border along the edge. This kind of gives the impression of a really tight form-fitting gear. So far so good, it's time for our next color mix. Like the last layer, I want this to cover nearly all the skin. This time though, starting with the brightest areas and feathering it towards the shadow. The main goal here is to flesh out the skin and knock down the overall redness. After the upper lip, cheekbones, and forehead were peached up, my shadows were looking a bit too strong, so I thinned the color down and put a glaze over it all. This normalized the shadows closer to the mid-tone and smoothed out all the transitions. This will hopefully keep him from looking too much like Herman Munster. For the last highlight, I hopped between our highest mix and pure barbarian flesh. This was highly reserved to the peak highlights of the face, like the tip of the nose and the furrows of the brow. Once he was dry, he was looking pretty good, and you could totally leave it like this as a style choice, but I think he looks a little weird without lips. A good starting place for your lip color is a step darker than your mid-tone, so I slashed his lips with our second darkest mix. I followed this with pure sanguine just to make sure the opening for the mouth doesn't get washed out. Then I cleaned up the bottom lip and gave it very thin vertical highlights. Last up for the face, Reichland Flesh Shade. This was me doubling back and giving my shadows a buff and then knocking them down, back and forth until I hit a sweet spot of a slightly exaggerated stylized look. And here's where I was happy with it enough to move on. Now, before we get Scott ready for his Blue Man Group audition, I'd like to take a moment to thank my subscribers over on Patreon. It gives me all the warm fuzzies to know that each month you guys dig deep to put a couple of dukes in the cup just to keep the wheels on this bus turning. I also want to extend a special thank you to this video's sponsor, SuperShark. Not only did they provide me with today's STL, but they also covered the resin. If you want to get your hands on Scott and any of the other STLs they produce, be sure to check out their Patreon. You'll find a link in the description below. But I think I already hear Scott whining over at the table. Gee! Let's get back to it. Royal Blue is going to be our starting point for the bodysuit. With most iterations of old One Eye here, his second skin usually is just a blue wetsuit that he accessorizes with a statement bandolier and some sassy boots. Thankfully, with this sculpt, we get some variety of fabrics and some cool piping to help the form stand out. It's a nice touch. As you can see, this is just a standard basing, but like with the visor, care must be made to paint super clean around the bandolier. Speaking of the bandolier, I can't be the only person that thinks that this is the silliest and most unnecessary design choice in all of Marvel. What is its actual function? I know he can hit the axe to communicate with the rest of the team, but he could have just used an earpiece, and it's not like he carries it for ammo or anything. It's just an extra 20 to 30 pounds of metal he's just running around with. And it literally puts a target on his chest. Not exactly the most well thought out wardrobe choice. With everything all Blue's Clues, he was ready for a highlight of Andrea Blue. I don't know who Andrea is or why she's so sad, but it's the perfect blue for highlighting the suit. I'm using a slightly atypical dry brush method here. What sets this apart from the dry brushing we've done before is that the surfaces here are relatively smooth, so we won't have a ton of edges and details to catch paint. To work around this, I'm using a slightly wetter brush and treating it more like applying rouge or contour makeup. Using my convenient thumb palette lets me check to make sure the paint is acting how I need it to. And in areas that are particular detail free, like the top of a large muscle, I'm using a bit more pressure than usual to really smush the bristles onto the surface so I can get some of my paint load onto the model. Then I gradually lighten up the pressure to be comparable to a typical dry brush to sort of buff the highlight and remove any clear directional streaks. Next, I want to add a bit of visual variety with some somber gray. Yeah, this is a gray, but it's also a blue. This way I can break up this massive blue while staying canonically accurate. While I will be making some departures from the original character design later on, but I don't think anybody will point to these jersey panels as immersion breaking. Try not to stress getting too super deep in the groin. My rule of thumb for areas like this is if you can only see it by picking it up and flipping over the model, no one's gonna see it because they shouldn't be picking up your statue. It's all willy-nilly. Once my panels were blocked in, I gave them each a once over with Nuln Oil, then dry brushed the somber gray back on them to clean up the messy wash. Once this was dry, the undersuit was done. Time to move on to the yellow bits, by first basing and fire orange. Now, the biggest issue with painting yellow is overcoming its poor opacity and coverage, so it helps a ton if you use an undercoat. You may be watching this going on wondering, why this coverage is as weak as just using yellow, and you'd be right, as orange has nearly just as hard of a time covering black as yellow does. But orange is an amazing undercoat color. Another widely used undercoat is pink, but for my money, pink doesn't bring as much warmth like orange does. So many thin coats are going to be the plan. My camera battery died out during the third coat, but in total, it took 7-ish coats to get full vibrancy. Then I swapped over to Cygnus Yellow. Now, even with an orange overcoat, this is going to take several coats to get full potency. Just remember, keep your coats thin, give it ample dry time between each one, and watch for pooling, and you should be good. Also, remember to stop when it's mostly solid yellow. You want that orange still peeking out around the recesses. Keep this subtle, and you'll end up with a powerful yellow with a sophisticated shadow. Next, to handle some details on the shoe, leather brown. Like with the gray panels on the suit, this is mainly to break up this block of yellow. Since I plan on painting the sole in a little bit, any overspill there isn't really something to concern myself with. After I gave all the brown panels a light tone wash, I pulled out the black to get the shoelaces. With the laces handled, it was time for ash gray to give Scott some soul. This was easy peasy, just paint within the lines and get a clean edge all the way around the perimeter. To finish off the feet, I brought back Greedy Gold. Each shoelace latch got a dab. Then I was feeling kind of crazy and gilded up his shoe buckles as well. To be perfectly honest, I should have done this back when I did the visor, but it completely slipped my mind. It'll still be gold, it just won't match the shine on his chest. I followed this up by doing his undies just like his boots. 9-ish coats of fire orange this time, followed by around 5 of yellow. Once again, when it comes to the crotch, don't try to be a hero. Only paint as far as your brush can take you. What's happening deep in his nethers is his business. I got the orange with good coverage all the way up in there, but no yellow made it. And thankfully that works out just fine due to the deep shadow. By the time I finished the undies, I remembered he also had gloves. I never want to paint yellow again, so I'm gonna put it out there now. Any requests for Sinestro or Reverse Flash will make me cry. Why? Because yellow. Now it's time to get Dark Earth to base all those straps and pouches. Which brings me to my next rant about 80s comic design. What are they holding up? Why 2 belts on each leg? He doesn't even put any of his pouches on him for easy access. Which is another thing. In my 30 years of being an X-Men fan, I can't remember a single time anything has ever been taken out of that utility belt. In fact, 50 cool points to anyone that can cite a time when anything came out of it and was utilized. Okay, ran over. I got so riled up, almost forgot to mention, I also used this to base his hair. I then followed this up with a bit of khaki as a highlight to the hair and to detail up the frayed edges of the mysterious pouches. Once the hair dried, I thinned down the Dark Earth to a glaze over the hair. I felt the khaki looked a little gray against the rest of it, and this tint was going to help shift it to a deeper brown and look similar to like dirty blonde highlights. Finally, the last detail to paint is his ruby quartz visor, using glory red and vermilion, and a technique I haven't really gotten into on this channel yet, wet blending. Like most techniques, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's mixing 2 wet paints while on the model. In its most simplistic application, it's as simple as adding a second color on top of the first one before it begins to dry. Using wet blending can get you the buttery smooth transitions that come easy with an airbrush, but it comes at the cost of a lot of time. But going in depth on that, we'll have to wait for a future project, because Cyclops is done. And dang, this just might be the best our little blue Boy Scout has ever looked. Most of the credit has to go to our friends over at SuperShark for this sick sculpt. These yellows look succulent, and the visor and face came out really nice. Maybe it's a little too Judge Dredd, but that's kind of my style. At the end of the day, if you'd like to give this model a try, be sure to head over to the SuperShark Patreon. They've been really good to us and they put out great work. I gotta get started on next week's project, so as always, thank you for watching, stay creative, and always enjoy the process.